I'm Patricia Ravitz, licensed marriage and family therapist, and I am here today with Jessica Jackson Sloan, who founded Cut 50. So Jessica will be speaking at our PAC luncheon on Saturday, the 28th of April at the Camp Annual Conference. So hi, Jessica.
Hi, Patty. Thanks for having me.
Great to see you. I was thinking a really good place to start would be to have you really talk about why you founded Cut 50 and what the story of the birthing of Cut 50 is.
Well, for me, it's mostly personal. When I was 22 years old, I stood in a courtroom in Georgia and watched as my husband was sentenced to 15, served 6. He'd developed a drug addiction while I was pregnant with our first daughter, who was only 2 months old and in my arms when we watched him being led off to prison. At the time, I knew nothing about the criminal justice system. I thought, prisons were where we kept bad people. What I grew to find out was that it wasn't bad people inside. It was people who had made a bad decision, but most of them were like my husband and needed help, not incarceration. So I decided to go to law school. I actually had to go to college first and then law school, and I became a public defender, and then went on to represent people on death row and their appeals here in California before I teamed up with Van Jones and co-founded Cut 50 to end mass incarceration through humanization and legislation.
Could you talk a little bit about meeting Van and how the two of you came together to found Cut 50?
Yeah, actually, you were involved, so I love it. We had Van Jones come out to the Marin Democrats. He was a speaker at Dining for Democrats, and you were driving him all around that night. And after he had given his speech, he had talked a lot about issues that were plaguing the country. And I went up and talked to him, since his focus had been on environment. I said, it's great that you're talking about the environment, but there's still people in cages. And I think he was taken a little bit aback, but he thought about what I said, and we stayed in touch. And he actually asked me to come sit down with him and talk about some of the work I wanted to do on criminal justice reform, which was an area he'd been deeply involved in back in the 90s before he ever got into the environmental movement. He was working in criminal justice and helping close jails all across the state of California. So we sat down and started coming up with not just the policies we wanted to see pass, but also, how we wanted to get there. And one of the resounding things that we decided was that the issue with mass incarceration starts with narrative change. It starts with dispelling the myth that people who go to prison are bad people. It starts with humanizing the families that are being broken by the system, as well as the people who are inside and coming home.
Excellent. Well, a little side note, I would say the matchmaking of you and Van is my greatest success in matchmaking. And every time I see Van, he always whispers in my ear a thank you for introducing the two of you.
Well, that's good to know. I know I'm not always the easiest. So.
Yeah. I think the last quote from him was, "You saved my life." So that's what Van thinks of you.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yes. So I wanted to move on to really talk more about what your accomplishments have been so far with Cut 50 and where you see yourself going from here.
Yeah, so this approach of humanization and legislation has proved to be very efficient. We started out working on federal legislation. We actually held a bipartisan summit for criminal justice reform. We had over 80 speakers, including everyone from Newt Gingrich to Cory Booker to the Kochs to Rick Perry to Van Jones and John Conyers. We had a whole bunch of unlikely characters, and it was amazing because if you actually closed your eyes that day and listened, you couldn't tell who was a Republican and who was a Democrat. That's how closely aligned people have been on this issue. From there, we helped with 3 different federal bills, 2 of which have passed at this point, the 3rd of which we're still working on. And then we really pivoted into the states because there's 2.2 million people who are incarcerated in this country. About 200,000 of them are incarcerated in a federal prison. So we wanted to make an impact for the 2 million of them who are out there locked up in prisons and jails. We started what's called the Empathy Network. It is a network of 90 plus organizations that are mostly led by directly impacted people, people who have either lived behind bars themselves or had a loved one who was incarcerated, and who are doing incredible work in the states around criminal justice reform. So we've sort of brought these organizations together to work on humanizing the issue. Every year we hold an annual Day of Empathy where we go up and talk to the state legislators and share our stories. Legislation across the country has popped out of that network. I'm pleased to say this last Day of Empathy, we had 35 states participating. So we held events in 35 states on the same day. 15 of them were focused on dignity for incarcerated women, which is another one of our huge campaigns. So last year we focused on youth in prison, anybody up to 25. We were able to end life without possibility of parole in California, get kids their records sealed for violent and serious felonies, as well as get them lawyers for while they're being Mirandized. I'm sure if any of you guys have worked with youth, you know, they don't quite understand when they're about to make the biggest decision of their life, whether or not to talk to a police officer or detective about what's happened. So we get them lawyers to help with that process. And then this year, we're really focused on women. The women's population has risen by 700% in the last 2 decades. Of course, you know, this has a huge impact on communities because 80% of the women who are inside are mothers. 86% of them, and that's self-reporting, 86% of them are victims of sexual assault before they get into the prison system. So it's a very different population in a lot of ways than the men who are coming in. So we've been really focused on trying to restore dignity to the women because the prisons really weren't built for women. Some of our legislation, and we've now got 10 bills in 10 states plus a federal bill, but some of the legislation focuses on ending the shackling of women when they're in labor, getting them the hygiene items they need, getting the male guards out of the bathrooms, which of course, you know, if you're a trauma survivor and a rape victim, standing there watching, having a man with a weapon on his waist watch you while you're naked in the shower or in a medical unit or in your housing unit is very traumatic. So that's really been our focus and what we're working on.
It's intense.
It is.
So as a psychotherapist, when I listen to your description of the work you're doing, the first question that really comes to my mind is, what about treatment for trauma survivors? Because we know that, you know, addiction and all kinds of, you know, negative behaviors come out of early childhood trauma. And our conference this year is really focused on addiction and trauma. So I wonder if you can, first of all, just, you know, let us know what kind of treatment, if any, there is available and what happens when people get out of prison.
So in prison in most states, and there are pilot programs that are spread throughout the country that of course are different, but in most states there really isn't a lot of help for people who are coming in. And as you may imagine, a large portion of the prison population suffers from addiction. Even if they're not in there for drugs, a lot of them perhaps had, you know, were using a substance at the time that they committed whatever crime it is that they are in there for committing. So they end up coming to prison and not getting the help that they need, not getting the treatment they need. And then they come out of prison and unfortunately, they're not given treatment then either. In fact, a lot of the time they're given a bus pass and $100 if they're lucky and told, good luck, have fun getting your life right. I had a devastating story, and it's really actually ongoing. Somebody who was in one of the prisons that I'm volunteering quite often, came to me and told me he was getting out in 2 weeks. And of course I, smiled and congratulated him, thinking, this is great, you're going home. Well, instead, this 20-year-old kid just burst into tears. And I was so perplexed. I said, why are you crying? He said, well, I was in 17, I came in when I was 17. I was in over 30 foster care homes. I was separated from my birth mother when I was 3 days old because I tested positive for meth. And I don't have a family. I'm coming out and I'm going to be homeless. And I know what that's like because I was homeless before I went to prison, and I don't want to go through that again. We worked really hard to find him a place that he could live in another county, a transitional home. But it literally took 5 of us calling every day for 2 weeks and using every political favor we had to get him moved to another county and get him into this expensive program. We had to find, a donor to pay for it. Unfortunately, when the money ran out and his time ran out, he's back on the streets. I just got a message from him the other day. So, it's a struggle. There's not treatment when you're inside. There's not treatment beforehand. And then there's not treatment when you get out. I will say there's some positive stuff on the horizon. We've seen the drug treatment courts across the country. Those actually address the underlying reason why people are committing the crimes they are, whether it's, suffering from mental illness, or if they have an addiction, or if there's something else going on in their life. They tend to get down to it and come up with a case plan and give them the resources they need to actually get on the right path. Regular traditional prisons have about a 74% recidivism rate. So 74% of the people going in end up coming back out. These drug courts have 86% success rate. So 86% of them don't get rearrested within the first 5 years, which is really the most crucial period of time. So there is some hope on the horizon. You asked, who does mass incarceration impact? First, I'll tell you it impacts all of us because it's costing us $80 billion a year, to incarcerate those 2.2 million people. There's 60 to 70 million Americans out there with a criminal record, which puts all sorts of obstacles in their way when they're trying to get housing or a job or even treatment. And then, of course, there's 28 million children who are growing up without a parent because their parent is incarcerated. And there's a huge impact and, of course, a cyclical effect on them growing up with a parent in prison. And it has a huge impact on society then and communities to have all these children who have a parent missing from the home.
Well, I know you're going to speak to this in more detail at the PAC luncheon, but I wonder if you just have a sense of what marriage and family therapists can do to support the work that you're involved in. These stories are just so heartbreaking.
Yeah, and I think it's amazing that you guys want to get involved. I really do. We need more people who understand trauma. This is a prison population of people who have experienced incredible trauma, whether it's childhood abuse or sexual trauma, substance abuse prior to coming to prison. And now that they're coming out into the communities, we need to make sure that they're getting help because they've actually been traumatized even more being inside of the prisons. So we're taking people who have had this trauma, traumatizing them further, and then dumping them off into our streets. So we need as many therapists to be getting involved, to be offering their services, to be linking up with nonprofits and drug courts and other courts across the country and offering to help with the treatment.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I'm really grateful that you're going to be coming to our conference and sharing more and supporting our political action committee, where we help to elect and re-elect different legislators who are really in support of mental health care and bills that support that. So I think our work is very tied together, and I'm really looking forward to having you come and share more with our members.
Thank you. Well, I'm looking forward to being there and to working more with you guys.